Hey there, welcome back. We're going to do a deep dive today on this book, Kill All Normies, Online Culture Wars. From 4chan and Tumblr to Trump and the alt-right.
Oh, yeah, this one's really something.
It really is, and it's by Angela Nagle.
Right.
And it's gotten praise from some really interesting corners. You've got the leftist podcast, Chapo Trap House, Jacobin Magazine.
Oh, wow.
Even David Columbia, the guy who wrote The Politics of Bitcoin, praised it.
Yeah, so it seems like it's speaking to a pretty diverse audience.
Yeah, hitting a nerve for sure. So maybe like for those of us who haven't been, like glued to the internet for the last decade, remind me what exactly is the alt-right?
Oh, man. It's a tough one to define, but in a general sense, it's like this mostly online movement that's like pushing back against the mainstream in culture and politics.
Right.
A lot of times they use irony and like provocative stuff to get their point across.
Okay, so almost like a counterculture, but online.
Yeah, you could say that, and a big part of what the book does is it contrasts that whole like optimistic vibe around Obama's election back in 2008 with what the internet was like by the time Trump won in 2016.
Yeah, I mean, 2008 feels like a million years ago.
Right.
And 2016 was just a completely different world. Like, I remember the Harambe meme was huge that year.
Oh, yeah, for sure. And while it was funny at the time,
Yeah.
it also had this like darker side to it.
Really?
Remember how people used it to like harass Leslie Jones online?
Oh, yeah, that's right. I had forgotten about that.
Yeah, it's a good example of how something that seems like harmless fun online can be used for like some pretty bad stuff.
Right.
And, Nagle's argument is that stuff like that, those were like early warning signs of how things were changing online.
So, like, where did all this change really begin?
Well, Nagle gets into specific corners of the internet, and like two of the big ones are 4chan and Tumblr, which were like polar opposites.
Right.
4chan is famous for being anonymous and for its transgressive humor and, of course, being a total meme factory.
Transgressive humor. Can you explain that a little more?
Yeah, sure. It's basically humor that's meant to like push boundaries and mess with social norms.
Okay.
They use shock value and offensiveness to get a reaction.
Got it. So how does that all tie into 4chan and the alt-right?
Well, 4chan was kind of like the alt-right's training ground in a way.
Oh, okay.
That's where they developed their look and how they communicated. A lot of their ideas came from there.
Interesting. And, that whole idea of transgression as a good thing isn't new. It's been a part of Western culture for a long time, even going back to philosophers like Nietzsche.
Yeah, totally. And Nagle even talks about like bell hooks.
Right.
And Milo Yiannopoulos to show how this concept is kind of baked into our culture.
Wow. Okay, so we've got this backdrop of transgression as like a virtue. So how did the culture wars really get going?
One of the first big battlegrounds Nagle focuses on is online gaming, specifically the whole Gamergate thing.
Oh, man, Gamergate? Yeah, wasn't that when Anita Sarkeesian, the feminist media critic, was getting like tons of harassment online?
Exactly, and it was a real turning point. It brought together all these different groups online who felt like they were pushing back against political correctness.
Okay, so things are really starting to heat up online.
Yeah.
But it wasn't all just 4chan, right? What about Tumblr and that whole like social justice scene?
Yeah. So Nagle looks at how Tumblr's style of identity politics had an impact on all of this too.
Okay, could you explain that a little more? But what do we even mean by identity politics?
So, identity politics, it's kind of a complex idea.
Yeah.
But it basically comes down to how our identities, like race, gender, sexual orientation, all of that, how they affect our experiences and our perspectives.
Okay.
And Tumblr was really big on this.
Right.
Concepts like intersectionality and check your privilege were everywhere.
Yeah, intersectionality. I've heard that term, but I'm not sure I totally get it.
It basically means that all the different forms of oppression like racism, sexism, homophobia, they don't just exist separately. They like overlap and intersect. So it creates unique experiences for different people.
Oh, okay. I see. So it's not just about being a woman or a person of color. It's about how all those identities combine and create different levels of disadvantage or privilege.
Exactly. And Tumblr became this place where people talked about these ideas, debated them. And honestly, sometimes it got really heated and led to a lot of conflict.
Interesting. So we've got these two online cultures, 4chan with its anonymous transgression, and then Tumblr focused on identity politics and safe spaces.
Right.
Sounds like a recipe for a clash.
Yeah, definitely. And Nagle's argument is that these two worlds, even though they seem totally separate, they were actually really intertwined.
Okay.
And they were both shaping the culture wars that were bubbling up online and eventually spilling over into the real world.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to deny that.
It really is.
Okay, so we've got these two big forces, 4chan and Tumblr, in the online culture wars. But didn't Nagel also talk about the manosphere?
Oh yeah, definitely. It's a big part of the story.
Could you remind me what that is again?
It's this whole network of online communities mostly focused on men's issues.
Okay, so kind of like men's rights groups.
Yeah, kinda. Some parts of it raise totally legitimate concerns about men, like fathers' rights and mental health stuff.
Right, that makes sense. But you said some parts, what about the rest of it?
Well, the manosphere also has this like really dark side.
Oh.
Some of the communities are like super anti-feminist and have some pretty toxic views on women.
Yeah, I've heard the term red pill thrown around in that context. What exactly does that mean?
It's this whole online community, you see it a lot on Reddit, where guys get together and basically vent about how the world is rigged against them.
And what about figures like Rushvi? Didn't Nagel mention him?
Yeah, Rushvi, whose real name is Dariush Velizadeh. He's a pretty controversial figure, known for being misogynistic in his writing and promoting this whole pickup artist thing.
Right, I've heard of him.
He even wrote, like, favorably about a book that blames Jewish intellectuals for, the supposed decline of Western culture.
Whoa, that's pretty out there.
Yeah, and Nagel uses him as an example of how the manosphere can go off the rails.
Yeah.
Like blurring the lines between actual concerns men have and straight up hate towards women.
This whole red pill thing seems to be a big theme in these online groups.
Mm-hmm.
Where did that term even come from?
Oh, it's from The Matrix, that movie where the main character gets to choose between the blue pill, which means staying in a comfy but fake reality,
Right.
or the red pill, which means facing the harsh truth.
Oh, right. I see the connection. So in the manosphere, the red pill represents waking up to the idea that men are the ones who are oppressed.
Exactly. And Nagel says this red pill thinking is really similar to what the alt-right believes, too.
Oh, how so?
Well, both the manosphere and the alt-right have this feeling of being like outsiders. Oh,
Like they've been screwed over by mainstream culture, and they think they're fighting against a system that's rigged.
right, which kind of brings us back to that title, Kill All Normies. Who are these normies exactly?
Normies is just their word for people who follow mainstream trends and values.
So basically anyone who isn't part of their little club.
Pretty much, yeah.
Okay.
It creates that whole us versus them thing,
Right.
and it reinforces their sense that they're better than everyone else.
And this rejection of normies is all part of that transgression thing we were talking about earlier, right?
Absolutely. Nagel argues that wanting to disrupt the mainstream, to shock and offend, it's a key part of how the alt-right operates.
But haven't countercultures always tried to shake things up? What makes the alt-right different?
Well, one thing Nagel points out is that the alt-right is really good at borrowing the style and tactics of older counterculture movements,
Okay.
especially that punk, anti-establishment vibe from the 90s.
Yay, I can see that.
They see themselves as rebels, fighting against a system that's trying to silence them. So they're taking cues from the past, but putting their own spin on it.
Yeah, exactly. And the internet gives them a way to do that, like a huge megaphone.
Right. They can completely bypass traditional media and create their own little echo chambers where their ideas can just run wild. It's really fascinating how Nagel connects these historical threads. It's like showing how different parts of culture are all linked together in ways we don't always see.
She's really good at showing the historical roots of these movements. For example, when she talks about the manosphere, she traces its roots back to guys like Norman Mailer, who was a big fan of portraying the psychopath as this rebellious figure.
So they're taking inspiration from some pretty surprising places.
Yeah, and the sources they draw from tell us a lot about what's really driving them.
There was also this whole concept of the carnivalesque that she talked about. What was that all about?
Oh, that's a term from this literary critic named Mikhail Bakhtin. He used it to describe the temporary flipping of the social order,
Okay.
where all the rules go out the window and chaos takes over.
So like Mardi Gras.
Exactly. And Nagel says that online spaces like 4chan embrace this carnivalesque spirit. Being anonymous and having no moderation, it creates an environment where literally anything goes.
Like a digital free-for-all.
Yeah, and Nagel suggests that this love of chaos reflects a deeper desire to just wreck the whole social order as we know it. They see themselves as taking on the power structures that, in their view, are screwing them over.
Okay, so we've talked about 4chan and the manosphere, but what about Tumblr and the whole identity politics scene? How do they fit into this?
Well, Nagel argues that Tumblr had a big impact on the culture wars too, but from a different angle.
You mentioned earlier that they were like two sides of the same coin.
Exactly. 4chan was all about this transgression and being anonymous, Well, Tumblr became a center for this new wave of identity politics,
Right.
with the focus on things like intersectionality and safe spaces.
So they were trying to make online spaces more inclusive.
Yeah, and their hearts were in the right place a lot of the time. But Nagel also points out that focusing so much on identity created its own problems.
Like what?
Well, for example, all that emphasis on trigger warnings and policing language that might be offensive, it led to people getting accused of censorship and being too sensitive.
Oh, so the alt-right saw this as like PC culture run amok.
Exactly, and they use stuff like that to push their own story about being silenced and oppressed by, the liberal elite.
Didn't Nagel also critique some aspects of this online culture, even though she seemed to be sympathetic to the goals of social justice?
Yeah, she was especially critical of how call-out culture works.
Remind me what that is again.
It's the whole thing of publicly shaming people online for doing or saying something wrong.
Like when someone gets canceled.
Exactly, and while it's supposed to hold people accountable, Nagel argues that it often creates this climate of fear where people are afraid to speak their minds.
So it ends up backfiring, even when the intentions are good.
That's what she seems to think. She even connects this phenomenon to the work of Mark Fisher, a British cultural theorist who wrote about the dangers of what he called the vampire castle.
The vampire castle. What's that all about?
It was Fisher's metaphor for this online culture of denunciation and shaming.
Okay.
He felt like it was actually hurting leftist movements because it was stifling disagreement and alienating potential supporters.
It's interesting how Nagel portrays 4chan and Tumblr as these opposing forces in the culture wars.
Right.
And they both seem to be contributing to the polarization we see online.
That's a key point of the book. And her overall argument is that these online culture wars aren't just staying online anymore.
They're impacting the real world.
Right. The lines are getting really blurry. She uses the violence at UC Berkeley during a speech by Milo Yiannopoulos as an example.
Oh, yeah, that was a few years back. He was a pretty provocative figure in the alt-right, right?
Totally. And his speech triggered all these protests that quickly got out of hand.
Right, I remember that.
There was property damage. People got hurt.
So what Nagel's saying is that the stuff they were saying and doing online directly led to that violence offline.
Exactly. And that's a pretty scary trend. The internet isn't just a playground anymore. It's a powerful force that's changing our society and politics in a major way.
It's a little unsettling to think about.
Yeah, it definitely makes you think.
It's funny, like after Trump won in 2016, everyone was talking about how it showed this disconnect between the coastal elites and like the forgotten men and women of America.
Yeah, that was the big story.
Right.
But Nagel actually kind of pushes back against that. She says the alt-right supporting Trump wasn't really about economics or class.
Oh, interesting. So what was it about then?
She points to how elitist the movement actually is. Like, they hate normies and anything mainstream or lowbrow. Like, remember, kill all normies.
Right. It's almost like they took pride in not being working class.
Exactly. And Nagel even talks about how some of these alt-right figures, like Milo Yiannopoulos, they bragged about being elitist at first, but then after Trump won, they suddenly switched to this whole champion of the working class act.
So it was more about cultural anxieties than economic ones.
That's what Nagel argues. They get the power of cultural capital.
Right.
They build these online worlds with their own language, their own memes, their own inside jokes.
Right.
It's a way to create a sense of belonging and to feel like they're superior to everyone else.
And that ties into their whole distrust of the mainstream media, right?
Totally. They see the traditional media as part of the establishment they're fighting against.
Right.
They build their own echo chambers online where their worldview gets reinforced and their opponents are demonized.
Which is where guys like Alex Jones and Mike Cernovich come in.
Exactly.
They've built these huge followings by pushing conspiracy theories and freaking people out about everything from vaccines to immigration.
And they're really good at bypassing traditional media to get their message out there.
Yeah, they don't run the gatekeepers anymore.
Nope.
Nagel also talked about the alt-right's fixation on Western decline.
Right. This idea that Western civilization is falling apart because of liberalism, multiculturalism, feminism. It's like at the core of what they believe.
It kind of sounds like what traditional conservatives have been saying for years.
Oh, yeah. There are definitely similarities.
About family values and morality eroding and all that.
For sure. But Nagel argues that the alt-right takes this whole decline thing to a way darker and more extreme place.
Okay.
Like, their rhetoric is full of misogyny, racism, and this weird romanticization of violence.
It's like they're longing for this mythical past where men were real men and everyone knew their place.
Yeah, and they see someone like Trump as the guy who can bring back that lost greatness.
She even tied it back to that 4chan culture we were talking about,
Right.
all that transgression and their love of guys like Tyler Durden from Fight Club.
Yeah, that whole hyper-masculine rebellion against society really speaks to them.
It all seems so pessimistic, though. Like, are they really that down on the future?
I think Nagle's point is that their pessimism is what fuels their anger,
Right.
and their desire for drastic change, even if it means destroying everything we have now.
So, like, what's the big takeaway here? What's the point of Kill All Normies?
I think she's basically sounding the alarm. She's showing us how the internet has become this breeding ground for extremism,
Right.
and how that's spilling over into the real world, which could be really dangerous.
Yeah.
It's like a wake-up call for all of us to start paying more attention to what's happening online and to be more critical of the information we're consuming.
It definitely gives you a lot to think about. If the internet is the new battleground for the culture wars, what does that even mean for democracy?
Right.
Like, how can we even have real conversations across these divides that seem so huge?
Yeah, those are the big questions we need to figure out. Nagle doesn't really give us any easy answers, but she makes us face the complicated reality of our digital world.
Yeah, and think critically about what's shaping it. Well, that was quite a deep dive. Thanks for walking us through it.
Oh, you're welcome.
This book really gave me a lot to think about.
It's definitely a fascinating topic,
Yeah.
even if it's kind of disturbing at times.
Yeah, it really makes you think. And for all of you listening, if you want to understand what's going on in the world today, Kill All Normies is worth checking out.
Yeah, for sure.
Just be ready for a wild ride. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time for another deep dive.